Hey folks, Chris Bosch here from Noble Warrior Leadership Ministry. Hey, welcome back to our course. This is Making Warriors, a Warrior's Rite of Passage. This is Module 8, and now we get to take a look at our next piece of armor, which is the Shield of Faith. And along with that, we're going to be taking a look at the discipline of peacemaking. And so in this module, we're going to be looking at the piece of our godly armor, that helps us to praise our way forward into battle, extinguishing the flaming arrows that Satan sends our way, and bringing peace to our circumstances. Folks, it's the shield of faith. Let's get at it. So our intent with this module is, just like we did with the previous armor, we want to sort through Paul's description here and come up with a working theory for the shield of faith. And once we have that, as we've been doing, we're going to dive a little bit deeper, and we're going to take a closer look at the discipline of peacemaking. And I'm going to talk about peacemaking in the age of outrage, and that should resonate with you. And then we're going to explore some simple antidotes to this scourge, this epidemic of anxiety that we have in our society today. So that's what we want to accomplish with this module, folks. Our pathway to getting there starts with our biblical role model. And I've probably said this each time. It's one of my favorite characters. It's the life of David. And he's going to demonstrate to us this idea of kind of living in this holy space that he calls in the shadow of the shelter of the Almighty, and how that shapes his life. And we're going to take a look at that. Then we're going to take the shield of faith through our analytical framework. We're going to generate our working theory. Then we'll go deeper. And as I said, we're going to take a look at this idea of peacemaking. And then we'll wrap it up. So our biblical role model is David. David was the second king of Israel, and he declares God is his shield, his fortress, his strong tower. And David lived out Psalm 91, verse 1 through 2. He says, "He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will abide in the shadow of the Almighty. I will say to the Lord, my refuge and my fortress, my God, in whom I trust." And all of that is to say that David always saw himself as occupying this holy space. That is the shadow of the shelter of the Almighty, living under God's protection, living within God's provision. And folks, his character exemplifies the power of living by God's faithful protection. So let's take a look at it. Let's start by saying that David was declared by God to be a man after God's own heart, which is pretty amazing and fantastic in and of itself. He was also a man who lived in that holy space, as we mentioned, under the shadow of the shelter of the Almighty, and he did so with faith. First of all, he lived by a conviction that God has got this in all circumstances. And an example of this is when he was facing the giant Goliath in single combat. David would declare, even before the battle began, that God had already delivered the giant into his hands. You can read that story in 1 Samuel 24. He's also a man who lived under the shadow of the shelter of the Almighty with trust. Trust in God and in God's timing. An example of this was the story of how David spared King Saul's life when he could have killed him. And so, out of jealousy, King Saul, who was the first king of Israel, he had marked David for death. He knew that David had been appointed or was going to be appointed as the next king, and so there was deep jealousy there, and he had marked David for death. They were adversaries, folks. There's no doubt about it. And Saul was constantly trying to kill David. And then there was an opportunity where David could have killed Saul, but he didn't. And he didn't because he trusted that, God would make him king at the right time. And in his mind, Saul was the anointed king. And who was he to slay Saul? You read that story in 1 Samuel 24 as well. David was also a man who he lived under the shadow of the shelter of the Almighty with humility. That is, he didn't think too highly of himself. And a good example of this was, David's response after the prophet Nathan had told David that God had promised to extend his family's dynasty forever. After hearing this, David would respond in prayer, "Who am I, Lord? And who are the members of my household that you have brought me this far?" And you can read that in 2 Samuel chapter 7. In addition to that, David was a man who, again, lived under the shadow of the shelter of the Almighty with integrity. David is a man who would take responsibility. Okay? I think an excellent example of this was after he had received help from the priest of the city of Nob. And by that, I mean David's on the run. He's looking for somebody to provide some assistance to him. And he gets some assistance from these priests in the city of Nob. And knowing that if Saul was to find out, folks, it would be bad news for these folks in the city of Nob. And Saul did find out, and he had the city sacked, and he had the priest killed. Later on, when confronted with his culpability in the death of the priest and the sack of Nob, well, David would admit it was his fault. He would take on the degree of responsibility that he thought was his, and he would then take in the sole survivor of that priesthood into care of him. And again, this is one of many examples where David would take responsibility for his mistakes, and he did what was in his power to make things right. You can read that story in 1 Samuel 22. He was also a man who lived under the shadow of the shelter of the Almighty with repentance. David demonstrated remorse for his sins. He earnestly sought God's forgiveness. David would go on to pen Psalm 51. This is the contrite sinner's prayer for pardon. And he wrote this after his sin of adultery with Bathsheba and then murdered her husband Uriah. In this psalm, David brokenheartedly confesses his sin. He asked for God's forgiveness, and he asked for restoration. And then finally, we'll look at this idea that David lived under the shadow of the shelter of the Almighty with reverence and devotion. David realized that his righteousness did not come from his actions, but from his love for and submission to God. Many of David's psalms, and folks, he wrote 73 of the 150 psalms. And then they were full of his heartaches. They were full of even questions that he had that he would bring before God. But folks, he never stopped serving and worshiping God. So what we see in David is a shining example of the power of living in this blessed space, right? This holy space, the shadow of the shelter of God. And it's also an example of his confidence and conviction that, well, God has got this in all circumstances. And an excellent example for us as we look at the shield of faith. So let's take a look at the shield of faith. We're going to take it into our analytical framework. So the first thing is, where do we find it in the Bible? It's Ephesians chapter 6. And of course, we looked at verse 14, and we have put on the belt of truth. Okay, that's buckled around our waist. And we've put on the breastplate of righteousness. And then we looked at verse 15, where we have fitted our feet with the readiness that comes from the gospel. And now in verse 16, in addition to all of this, take up the shield of faith with which you can extinguish the flaming arrows of the evil one. So there's quite a bit to unpack there, and we're going to take a look at that. All right, so let's start with our simple understanding of a shield. Folks, we all know what a shield is, right? It's that tool that a warrior uses. It's made of reinforced armor, and in the terms, when it comes to the Roman soldier, that shield was covered in leather. It protects the soldier from their adversaries' attacks, so strikes and thrusts and slashes and projectiles. And you can see a picture here. And again, I think we all know what shields are. Now, it may be used for single combat. However, and this is important, this is important that you remember this, it is most effective as part of a shield wall, or a system of shields in which soldiers interlock their shields in a formation, creating an immensely stronger protection capability. And it wasn't just the Romans that knew this. It was pretty much all of the ancient warriors understood this principle, the principle of the shield wall. How about a simple understanding of faith? And I got to tell you, folks, this wasn't easy for me to just come up with the simple understanding of faith and just kind of lay it out for you like that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to have to take you through how I reasoned this out, because faith is an abstraction that is hard to get, at least my head around, and I had to sort through it. And here's what that looked like. So I started with Hebrews 11, verse 1, which tells us, now faith is confidence in things hoped for. Okay? And it's a conviction of things not seen. And folks, that just didn't get me there. That's a good starting point, but I need more. And I had to really struggle through trying to understand what is faith. And I've had to sort it out myself, and I'm going to take you on that journey now. So I started with what I know. Believe it or not, that really is a technique I use in all things. So what do I know? Well, I know it's impossible to please God without it. I know that it has something to do with, believing something without seeing it. I know that Galatians 3 verse 11 says that the righteous will live by faith, and I kind of tie that back to what we looked at when we did our exploration of the breastplate of righteousness, that we believe that Christ died for us. That's what makes our armor. Okay, so the righteous will live by faith in what? That Christ died for us. So there's a faith element there. I also believe that it has something to do with being thankful, that is having gratitude for what God has done for us. Because even if we can't see it, we know that God is at work around us, He's at work in us, and He's at work for us. Okay? So it has something to do with being thankful and grateful for what God has done. And I think it also has something to do with trusting God and obeying God, even when it seems contrary to our understanding. For example, the idea of praising our way forward into battle, which is something that we're going to be exploring here in detail. But we've looked at that when we looked at Joshua and the Battle of Jericho, when we looked at Jehoshaphat and the battle against the Moabites. This idea of praising your way forward. It seemed to me that that's an act of faith. Right? And then finally, as I continued to inventory what I know it's the hope that God has a future already planned for us, a future to prosper us, a future where He takes care of us. So there's this gratitude element, there's this trust element, there's this hope element, gratitude for what God has done, trust in what He's doing now, and then a hope for what it is that He's bringing in the future. And by inventorying what I know, it starts to resonate with me. Right? Now, I add to that a sermon that I recently ran across. Is by Pastor Joel Osteen, where he was talking about how faith is, praising God even when circumstances are dire. And again, that resonated with me. I think that is the same idea of praising your way forward into battle. So building on what I saw in Hebrews 11:1 and what Joel Osteen said, I kind of come to this, what you might call simple understanding of faith. That faith is a confidence and a conviction that no matter what the circumstances, God has got this. And then I combine that with this idea that faith is composed of, a foundation of gratitude for what God has done, trust in what God is doing, and then hope for what God will do in the future. And it seemed to me, and when I look at it that way, that, I can help build my faith by working on my gratitude. That seemed to be a key to growing in my faith. Because it's not a stretch, folks, to trust that God is and hope that He will when I make the effort to recall and to remember, trusting in what God is doing and hoping for what God will do. That's not hard when I can recall what God already has done. So for me, this simple understanding kind of all boils down to some iteration or some variation of the phrase, God has got this. And I can use that idea as a way to advance forward in all circumstances. Again, praising my way forward, thanking God, keeping my mind fixed on God as I move forward. And David knew this in his Psalms, where he called God his shield, his fortress, his shelter, his strong tower, when he talked about this holy space that exists in the shadow of the shelter of the Almighty. So what happens when we put the idea of a shield next to the idea of faith? So a shield of faith. And to me, what comes to mind is, again, the idea that I can praise my way forward. And I think is an excellent expression of faith in action. Faith in action is a sense of security and protection, which is what a shield is, right? It's a sense of security and protection. Okay, so the shield of faith is that, very much so. God inhabits our praises and He protects us. In other words, He secures us. So as I'm praising my way forward, I've got this shield that is protecting me because God is inhabiting those praises. And we've already talked about this. Security sets the conditions for peace. When you have security, peace can now flourish. And peace then produces joy. I can now feel joy because I'm secure and I'm at peace. And then joy quenches anxiety. And it turns out that that's kind of a formula that we're going to be looking at a little bit later on for how do we deal with anxiety. It starts with security, the security of the shield of faith, that then can bring forth peace. Peace that can then bring forth joy, and joy quenches anxiety. So we continue to look at the shield of faith. I look at it as an idiom or a metaphor for the idea that faith is as faith does. In other words, faith is demonstrated and manifested through action, this commitment to move forward. So why does this matter, folks? Well, so much of life involves being willing to go into the unknown and face scary things. You know, when I was looking at starting this ministry, everything in front of me was unknown. Okay? But the shield of faith is going to help me to move forward into this unknown and face all the scary things that are out there. You know, there's an ancient idea that our greatest treasure lies down the darkest hole. You know, and that what we need the most in our life lies where we most fear to go. Folks, it's the shield of faith that gets us there. It means praising our way forward, pressing into the unknown where those dangers lurk, where those monsters are, and knowing that God has been, is, and will be our protector. That is our shield. Again, God has got this. All right, folks, so I think that's a pretty good landing spot for a simple understanding. Let's get into our comparative analysis here, and I'm going to combine Brad Gray and Lynn Woods. Remember, Brad Gray has got the YouTube series. He did a whole segment on the shield of faith. Lynn Woods is the Bible study. He did a whole chapter on the shield of faith. Both of them, their bottom lines are very similar. The idea that the shield is defensive armor that's used for protection, and that it is best used in community as part of a shield wall. Okay, kind of hearkening back to this idea of fellowship and being in community with other believers. Now, Larry Richards, a little bit different, somewhat different perspective, I should say. He talks about, in his book, The Full Armor of God, that the shield is not our faith, but it's God's faithfulness. That is, taking up the shield is to focus on God and not the battle. And folks, I believe that's exactly what we've been saying, that we praise our way forward. And as we do, God's going to inhabit the praises, and he's going to be faithful for dealing with what lies in front of us, that God has got this. I think it's a very similar perspective there. All right, folks, so we've hit that point where it's probably about the right time to take a break. I'd ask that you come back and join us in the second half of our module. When we come back, we're going to continue on with our discussion of the shoes of the gospel of peace. Until then, folks, take care and carry on. All right, folks, welcome back. So we're going to pick up our discussion on the shoes of the gospel of peace with our In the Weeds segments. So let's get at it. So in the weeds, all right, again, this is an opportunity for me to share some personal insights. And folks, I want to really kind of drill down into this idea of the flaming arrows that Satan sends our way, because we didn't put it through a simple understanding. We didn't look at it from a comparative analysis, but I want to look at it. So I'm going to use this segment to talk about how the shield of faith quenches the flaming arrows that Satan sends our way. First of all, what are these flaming arrows? That's a good question to ask. Well, I believe that they are attacks that Satan sends our way that are meant to inflame or trigger us. Right? So it could be schemes that provoke anger and arguments that ruin relationships. It could be deceptions that invoke envy and lust and greed, that is, ruin our own satisfaction in God's provision. It could be reminders of our brokenness and insufficiency. It could be God, Satan whispering our ear that we're not worthy, okay? And that we have no standing before God. Okay? The kind of thing that cause guilt and remorse and separate us from God. Okay? And it's my sense that Satan's demons are constantly at work fashioning these arrows, folks. So if you tell a lie and you think you're hiding something, I can tell you right now there's an arrow being made that is all about that thing that you're hiding being discovered and creating the conflagration around that issue. Okay? Because they're tailor-made for our vulnerabilities, and they're designed to be aimed at our hearts for all the reasons that I just went into. The idea is that they're not just shot at us, though, folks, but that they actually hit our shield. Because how does the shield of faith quench a flaming arrow? Well, it's going to require that arrow hit in order for the shield to do what we just talked about. So how is it that the shield is going to quench the flames? Well, it's my sense that we focus on God, and God is then faithful to put the flames out. Okay, so how do we do that? Well, first, we recognize that the flaming arrows are coming our way, and we acknowledge them for what they are. Right? They're designed to trigger us, okay? And that will help us to avoid being triggered. Okay? When that arrow hits, okay, we don't want to be triggered. We don't want to be inflamed, okay? Because if we go down that path, it's just going to fuel the flame. So you got to recognize the flaming arrows that are coming your way for what they are. Instead, I want to encourage you to praise your way forward. As those flaming arrows are coming your way, even if they're hitting your shield, praise your way forward. Exercise faith. And this puts your mind on God instead of the problem. And then God responds by quenching the flame. I don't know how he does it. God does what God does, right? Remember, God occupies the praises of his people. Bring him to bear on the issue that's in front of you, and in this case, those arrows that are being shot at you, and do that tenaciously as long as this onslaught of flaming arrows is being fired at you. All right, folks, so I think we've got a pretty good sense now of what Paul is talking about. I think we can generate that bottom line working theory, and I think this is a good way to look at it, that taking up the shield of faith, that is adopting the conviction that no matter our circumstances, that God has got this, God is protecting us, and that allows us to stand firm. It allows us to advance forward. It's best used in community with other believers. Please don't forget this. If you feel under attack, or if you feel you're going into a what you might call fire sack, that means you're going into a place where you know you're going to get hit by arrows, call other believers. Lock shields with other believers. Call for them to pray for you. As you advance forward, you now have the community of believers that are with you. And God is faithful to quench the flaming darts, and when we are faithful to focus on him. Folks, I'll go back to this mantra, praise your way forward. It's what Joshua did at Jericho with his shout. It's what Jehoshaphat and his army did in order to engage the Moabites. Right? And all of this, folks, is going to protect us from Satan's flaming darts, these lies that are tailor-made for our particular vulnerabilities, designed to inflame and ruin us. What are the kinds of things that can be triggered? Our anger, our resentment, our guilt, our envy, even our greed. Right? So the shield of faith is there for us to protect us against these attacks. And of course, we want to go deeper. And for going deeper today, I want to take a look at a couple concepts. I want to talk about how the shield of faith brings peace and facilitates our ability to be peacemakers. And then I want to talk about how we can be peacemakers in the age of outrage as part of our Going Deeper segment. So let's talk about using the shield of faith as peacemakers. And we'll start that discussion with the reality that the shield of faith is a piece of armor that also brings peace. How is that? Well, we talked about a shield brings security. All right, what can flourish in security? Security brings peace. And when we have peace, we can now have joy. I can be joyful as I reside in the peace of the security of my shield. And then what does joy do? Joy quenches anxiety. So what is a peacemaker then? Well, let's take a look at that. Well, those who use their shield and use their faith to cover others. It's those who seek to reconcile people to God, that is sharing the good news that Jesus laid down his life to make peace between God and sinners, and those who seek to reconcile people to people, and those who seek to de-escalate conflicts, that is, to use their shield in a situation that quenches the flaming arrows that are being sent maybe at somebody else. That's what we're talking about when we say peacemakers. And Jesus makes special mention of these types of warriors. In Matthew 5:9, he says, well, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Which I always found really interesting. And then I explored that a little bit further. It says, why does Jesus call them children of God? Well, because God delights in those who reconcile others to himself. And those who bring the gospel are beautiful. And you'll find that in Isaiah 52, verse 7. And it's because God reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us, believers, the ministry of reconciliation. And you'll see that in 2 Corinthians 5:18. It's because those who witness for Christ, who share their faith with their friends and wherever there's an opportunity, they are serving in the name of Christ. They are ambassadors for peace. And you'll find that in Matthew 10, verse 41 through 42. And it's because those who bring reconciliation to broken relationships, well, they're carrying on the work of Jesus, who is the Prince of Peace. And because those who bring the wonderful message of God's peace to the world, they're peacemakers. And, well, Jesus says that they are children of God. So why? Well, because Jesus says so. And I'll take that. I think that's a good way to look at that. So now I want to take a look at this idea of peacemaking in action, peacemaking in the age of outrage. And it's really interesting because if you read James chapter 3, verse 14 through 18, James is talking about two kinds of wisdom, and the first brings discord and the second brings peace. And it's almost as if James, well, he could see the times we're living in now as he describes the first kind of wisdom. And he calls this the wisdom of discord and outrage. Okay, so let's take a look at what he says. Verse 15, but if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Verse 15, such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but is earthly, it's unspiritual, it's demonic. And folks, when I read that, I'm thinking of that unholy trinity that we looked at back in Module 2. And then verse 16, for where you have envy and selfish ambition, well, there you're going to find disorder and evil practice. So that's the first kind of wisdom. But by the grace of God, there's another kind of wisdom, and it's a peacemaking wisdom. Where he tells us, verse 17, but the wisdom that comes from heaven was first of all pure, is then peace-loving, it's considerate and submissive, it's full of mercy and good fruit, it's impartial, and it's sincere. And here's the verse that really excites me. Verse 18, peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness. All right, folks, that deserves to be unpacked a little bit. So starting with this idea that wisdom of heaven is pure. That means pure of heart and intent. All right, we're not going at it with any sideways ambitions here. This is a pure of heart and intent to bring peace. Right, which the next phrase that he uses, I think, is all about peace-loving. That's a desire or a longing to share the deep, abiding peace that comes from reconciling with God and walking in holiness. And he mentions being considerate. This is the idea of selflessness, okay, where we show regard for the needs and feelings of others. Okay, then he mentions being submissive. Okay, submissive, folks, does not mean cowering in a corner. It means, well, demonstrating that you are humble, that you're restrained. It means being non-aggressive. And he talks about being full of mercy. This is a call for us to forgive as we have been forgiven. And he talks about how the wisdom that comes from heaven is also impartial. That means it's not biased. It's fair and it's just. And then finally, he talks about how wisdom from heaven is sincere. That means it's genuine and it's real. And I think that ties right back to that first word, pure. Pure of heart and intent. Links to sincerity and being genuine and real. All right. So, folks, I believe that wisdom from heaven is how we make peace in the age of outrage. Okay. Let's make some more peace here. Let's talk about antidotes to anxiety. These are some biblical action steps for making peace. And this is just a few, and I'm not a psychologist or psychiatrist, but I know the Bible gives us some action steps that we can take that the Bible tells us will bring peace. Okay, so for example, if we look at Proverbs 3, verse 5 through 6, trust in the Lord with all your heart, lean not on your own understanding, acknowledge him in all of your ways, and he's going to make straighter paths. Now, and I like to tag onto that, this idea that God has got this, folks. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, lean not on your own understanding, acknowledge him in all your ways is keep your mind fixed on him, right? We also have Romans 15:3 that says, may the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace as you what? Well, as you trust in him. Right? So the full measure of joy, the full measure of peace comes from trusting God, and that you may overflow with hope by the power of the Holy Spirit. So this full measure of peace, full measure of joy, hope overflowing comes to those who trust in the Lord with all our heart. Okay, Matthew 6, verse 33 talks about how we should seek first the kingdom and his righteousness. Right? We shouldn't worry about things. Go to God first. First thing, and I see this as kind of a call to do this every morning. First thing in the morning, seek first the kingdom and his righteousness. Lay your day before God. You know what? He's going to take care of it. God has got this. All right? And then we can go to Isaiah 26:6, the idea that when we keep our minds fixed on Christ, when we acknowledge him in all of our ways, when we practice his presence, well, Isaiah 26:3 tells us that God will keep in perfect peace those whose minds are steadfast because they trust in you. So keeping our minds fixed on Christ and trusting him is going to give us perfect peace. Right? I'm going to say that again. Keeping our minds fixed on God, on Jesus, and trusting him. God says he'll give perfect peace. So that's the second time in the Bible where God says, if you trust me, I'm going to give you peace, I'm going to give you joy, I'm going to give you hope overflowing. And then we can look to Philippians 4, that chapter. I see it as like just full of peacemaking solutions. Maybe even call it the peacemaking chapter in the Bible. I don't know. I just see lots of solutions in there. So Philippians 4, verse 4 through 5 talks about, well, we should rejoice. And then Paul says, again, I say rejoice, as if he needed to reiterate. Let your gentleness be known to all. And I see this as gentleness, kindness, mercy. I see this as your presence of mind, that you're well-grounded, if you will. Why? Because the Lord is near. Right? And this idea that the Lord is near. I don't need to freak out. I don't need to be anxious. And then he would go on in Philippians 4, verse 6 through 7. So right after that, he says that we should be anxious for nothing, but we should pray in all occasions, that we should bring our requests to God with thanksgiving, and that God is going to provide us with a peace that's going to guard us, guard our hearts, guard our minds, in a way that we just can't comprehend. Right? So we're told to not be anxious, that we bring our issues and our requests to God, and that God's going to guard our hearts and our minds. That's a promise in the Bible, folks. Philippians 4, verse 6 through 7. And then he goes on right after that to talk about what we should think on. In other words, I would call this empowered thinking. Now, back in Module 4, we talked about, Paul says, do away with ignorant thinking. And I said Philippians 4, verse 8 through 9 is the solution. Well, it's empowered thinking. It's the idea that we think on that which is holy and pure and true and good and so on and so forth. Let that occupy our mind, as opposed to the worries and stress and concerns. How about a peacemaker warrior visual? Now, this might seem cheesy, but folks, anything that you can put in front of your eyeballs, so your eyeballs can burn an image in your brain, is an effective tool. And I showed you the godly warrior image back in Module 3. Something like that I look at every day. It's just an affirmation. right? That God has got this, that I am in God's hands. Yeah, God has got this, and there's a force field around me. This is the hope that God has got this, and within that force field, I can be filled with joy. I can be filled with peace, and there's no room for anxiety in that holy space. Serve. We've been talking about serving a lot in this course. A service is also a solution to anxiety. As you put your mind on somebody else and something else, and helping them to carry their load. Okay? Take up the shield of faith, folks. That's what this module is all about. That is, prayerfully put on the armor of God and then take up the shield of faith and praise your way forward. Gratitude-centered prayer. In other words, going back to what Philippians 4, verse 6 through 7 says, is that when we bring a prayer to God, remember to be grateful, to bring it with thanksgiving. Why? Because going back to this idea that if we're grateful for something, it's because God has, that then's going to facilitate our ability to trust that God is, and we can certainly now hope that God will in the future. All right? So gratitude-centered prayer, I think, is a powerful tool. We're going to look at that in a little bit more detail here in a second, but remember, folks, peace brings joy, and joy quenches anxiety. So I want to drill down a little bit more before we wrap things up and talk about the discipline of gratitude. This is so simple for us to do, folks. It's totally on us. We can do it. Discipline of gratitude. Remember that faith is built on a foundation of gratitude. We're thankful that God has all the things in our past. We keep those front of mind so that we can then trust that God is and hope that God will again. Okay, this idea that peace plus joy plus hope overflowing is what we gain from that, right? And that harkens back to Romans 15:13 that we just looked at. It all hinges on gratitude as a starting point. And again, we have full 100% control over exercising gratitude. Okay? For example, you've heard the term, count your blessings. Perhaps that's an overused term, but I would suggest that no, really, you count them. Now, one way to do that is every time you go into prayer, think about just the last 24 hours. And starting with the fact that you're able to get up, walk, and breathe, start to inventory the things that you're thankful for. And believe me, that list is going to grow. Right? Don't worry about the things that are out there that are bothering you. Count your blessings. Inventory them. Meditate on them. Focus on them. And thank God that He has brought those things into your life. And so my process of fostering gratitude is to reflect on some things. And it starts with, who am I, but that God hasn't made me this way. And I just think of all the blessings I have in terms of how God made me. And I just line those up in front of Him, and I thank Him for it. Where am I, but that God didn't put me here? I had this opportunity to go up to the northwest, and it was winter. And folks, I love the mountains. But when you go there in winter, it's like, I don't like the cold. I don't operate well in the cold. And no matter how much I love the mountains in snow, if I'm not skiing, it's just not something that I look forward to. And so when we got home from that, I was just so amazingly grateful, to be walking around in beautiful sunny weather, 70 degrees, and here it is at the first week or so of December. So where am I? But God didn't put me here. And I also reflect on, what do I have? What are the things that I have in my life, but that God didn't give them to me? And of course, there's a whole list of things that I can think of that I can be grateful for there. What am I able to do? What are my capabilities? But that God didn't enable me to do those things. And again, a whole list of things will emerge from that list. And so, folks, we can wrap up now and we can say that our shield of faith is a conviction that, no matter our circumstances, God has this. God's going to protect us as we stand firm or as we advance forward. And we know that the shield of faith is best used in community with other believers, and start practicing this. I'm going to tell you that it's going to be a very powerful insight that you can apply to your life. We know that God is faithful to quench the flaming darts when we are faithful to focus on Him. And out of this, the mantra is praise your way forward. God has got this. All right, folks, that's all for Module 8. Thanks for joining me in unpacking what Paul calls the shield of faith and exploring the ideas of peacemaking in the age of outrage. So next up, we have Module 9. We're going to look at the helmet of salvation and the discipline of guarding our thoughts and critical thinking. Until then, take care and carry on.